Hey, Dick. Hey, Rick.
Good morning.
Let's see. I think we're still waiting on John and Chris. I didn't see an email from them saying they weren't going to be able to make it. So, and I did see you, Jordan. I know you sent out emails this morning, so everyone should have it on there. They've certainly been reminded of it this morning.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah. So we'll give them another. Well, why don't we actually get started with calling to order, and we'll do the roll call, and maybe they'll join while we're in process for that. So we'll call to order the Fiscal Policy Work Group in the Commission to Study School Funding. Today is, let's see if I can get the month right. Today it's October 29th, 2020. Just a little bit after 10 o'clock in the morning. So we'll get things started with a roll call of the members. I'll start it out. Dave Luno here in Hopkinton with Ozzie the long-haired dachshund, and Mel.
Mel Myler calling in from Port Clyde, Maine.
Great. And Bill.
Yes, Bill Ardinger and at home in Concord, and my wife's in the house, but I'm alone here.
Great, thanks. And Mary Heath.
Mary Heath here in Manchester, home alone.
Great. And Dick Ames.
Yes, I'm here in Jaffrey in my home office alone. Thank you.
Fantastic. And Chris Dwyer.
Chris Dwyer here at home in Portsmouth, alone.
Okay. And Rick Ladd.
Rick Ladd is here, alone in Haverhill, New Hampshire, in body only, exhausted.
And John Beardmore.
Morning, John Beardmore in Hopkinton.
Great. So I think we're at full strength this morning. So thanks everybody. We got another long day ahead. Jordan, everything looking okay as far as people being able? I see we've got 5 attendees. So
Yeah, we're okay. So as you may have noticed, the Zoom link for this changed a couple of days ago, and so I think we've updated it in all the, on the website, the legislative calendar, everything. But I think if you had an older version of the link, I'll be monitoring that. I haven't gotten any calls or emails about it, but just to let folks know, I don't. It's been noticed, but I don't think there'll be any issues. We've got folks on here, but just to... Okay.
So so this is going to apply to all the work group meetings today. And so if somebody clicks on that older link, what would happen?
Well, they would get taken to a non-functioning Zoom meeting, and so then they would call the phone number listed, which goes to me, or they'd send an email, which goes to me. And then I would direct them to the correct link, or hopefully they'd go to the Carsey website, and then the commission website, and they would be able to see the correct link there as well.
Okay. So. But at least the phone number, like is laid out in the governor's emergency order, is functioning, because if you can't have, if you're somehow you do not get access, you call that phone number. You'll pick up the phone. Yep, right there. So we'll see you go like that and give them instructions to get in. All right. So is everybody okay with that? With that plan in place, with that provision in place? It seems to me that it's consistent with the governor's emergency order. Then we're going to go ahead and proceed. So we got a lot on the docket for today, and we're going to start out talking about some draft principles that Jordan sent around earlier, and I put these together. They're not exhaustive. They're not complete. They're not. In some cases they might contradict each other. So I think what we're hoping to do this morning is to sort of hash these things out, their general principles, clarify the intention or wording of them, add or drop them as we may add to them, or drop these as as we see necessary, and basically help us to craft a set that that we can bring forward to the commission next week. And so you know, it's always been sort of my style to try to be collaborative and in this type of work. It is a work group. It's supposed to be messy, you know, and obviously we can't. This is how we do things in a remote environment. So we've got 6 attendees watching us make a mess of this stuff, and that's absolutely fine. But that's why it's called a work group. So Jordan,
Dave?
yeah, Dick.
I just wonder if you could speak to the schedule. What time do we have as a work group to hash this out ahead of us? You know, we've got these 2 hours, and what else?
Well, so no, that's a good question. So I think you know, let's try to be as productive as we can in these 2 hours. The commission will also be able to. So I mean, we're not going to necessarily have to vote on stuff today, but the commission's going to have to take positions over the next couple meetings on principles, and I think once the principles make their way into a final report, then the commission is going to have you know, final authority over the language in the final report as well. But I'm sure some of that language will be you know, tightened up or you know, expanded upon to make it more clear during the drafting process. But all of that is going to be subject to obviously coming back to the review and approval of the commission, the full commission. But you know, today I think the bottom line of this is help us craft a set of principles to bring forward to the next meeting. And you know, what do you like? What do you not like? Where do we need to add clarification? Jordan and I will put stuff together. You can certainly email ideas and additional context or words, and we can you know, we'll put something together. But hopefully we're defining what the branches look like today, and go from there. I mean, I don't know how any better to explain it. This is
Okay.
working. This is working around the table with you know, sleeves rolled up. So
Yeah, well, we better get on with it because we're.
all right.
we're in
So
time.
so anyway, Jordan, you had sent out some principles as a starting point for discussion, and
Right.
everybody can see those, and people who are attendees who are going in through Zoom can see this too, right, Jordan?
Yep, that's correct. Anyone watching on their computer or other device can see, and then also they can find these on the commission website.
Okay, great. So and would it be helpful to turn on change tracking just so that we can
Yes,
see
I
stuff?
think, yeah, I've got it on.
Okay, great. So the first couple of principles are related to the state property tax, and not taking a position on revenue sources, but instead talking about a principle that I think we've discussed both in the work group as well as in the commission meeting, and on how the state property tax should be collected, and where it should be remitted. And so the principle here is the state property tax is a state tax, and should be remitted to the state treasury. And as a sort of clarification on this, and we've had some discussion on this too, the state property tax is collected locally, so it's collected by your local tax collector. complications and duplicative collection processes. So I'd sort of open it up to the floor to see if people like this, they don't like this, they want some more clarity to it. Not saying the state property tax is going up, not saying it's going down, just saying how it works. Mary.
David, a question I have is, are these going to be listed in an order of priority, or these are just principles that we're discussing now? And my second comment would be, do we need something that, a belief that we learned a lot from the report from our consultants, and we've learned that those school districts that are doing really well and are well-funded, achieve at high levels. And then we have places like Manchester that don't, and there's inequity in the funding. Do we need to come out with some kind of, are we thinking that everybody's gonna get the same, or are we gonna try and do some targeted money? So that for me is I know it moves from what your statement is, but it's a basic premise upon which we're setting our beliefs on, and the principles are driven by that.
Yep. So we've got some of those further down
Okay.
in here, and like I sort of mentioned at the top, they might contradict with each other. Maybe as written they contradict. Maybe if changed they don't contradict. This is really a starting point for work. And also these aren't the only principles that are going to come forward to the commission. There's going to be principles that are put together through the other work groups as well, and they may have to be combined. There may be some overlap, but really trying to come to an understanding where we've got agreement, disagreement, and what do we want to bring forward. So you don't necessarily have to agree to everything today, but help put together the what we want to bring forward next time.
So I think maybe this was behind Mary's question. This one is a particularly difficult one to start with, I think, because while it looks on the surface innocuous, it has huge implications. So that's perhaps what was behind her question. And I know, at least at this point, while I can agree with most other things, I'm not sure I'm ready to agree with this one. And that's why I think it's a hard starting point.
Okay, I actually took a different, I thought it was an easy starting point, because frankly, I think we've got strong consensus throughout the commission on this point. And but if we want to move down onto some others first and see where those land, we can do that. So why don't we do that? Let's
Dave, I'd like to make a comment. Back in 2008, when the formula, which, we're all driving back towards that, and then we've been modifying ever since, and now we're looking for some radical changes from that. The 2008 formula stated that the SWEP money was gotten through local and directed to the state. And I believe that what we have is, as I've heard Mr. Ardinger say several times, a distribution problem. And I do believe that part of the costing of an education is that these are hard decisions. Yes, this is an issue which will generate a whole lot of discussion from elected officials. It's not necessarily a Republican or a Democratic issue.
That's right.
It's an issue of wealth communities versus non-wealthy communities. It's also, I think, a basic principle, however, that when I look back at the 2008 formula and the sheets which came out supported by the majority and the minority of that report, nobody was oppositional to SWEP. It was other issues that there were questions about whether in fact we start in the third year when we're talking about the labor costs, or we started the first year of a bachelor's. Whether we, we were looking at down in the weed stuff. Now this issue right here, I believe, I guess I believe as you do, Representative Luno, that this I thought would be one of the more simple principles, but not necessarily a simple principle for the House of Representatives and the Senate to swallow.
I agree with all of that, Rick. And I think a lot has changed as well since 2008, on the whole idea of the state property tax, because the Department of Revenue Administration has come a long way in terms of their technology used to determine equalized valuations, and so you don't have the same type of issue that was I think brought up in Sorrel with respect to taxpayer equity issues that I think it's largely been resolved. We've had testimony on that. And I agree, Rick, that I think from a commission standpoint, this should be one of our easier points to discuss. But I think it is going to certainly raise a lot of discussion should a policy like this come to the floor of the House.
Dave, this is Bill.
Yep. And Bill, and then I saw Dick's hand too.
Oh,
yeah.
Go ahead, Dick. Sorry. Oh, you go.
No,
first.
Bill, take it. Yeah.
Okay. So the one thing I think that might address a little bit of Chris's concern would be to start off with saying something like, to the extent that the state budget contribution to public education is funded with a statewide tax on non-utility real property, right? The commission would conclude that tax, to the extent used, should be consistent with certain requirements. And to some extent, Chris, I'm wondering if that to the extent language kind of, gets away a little bit from the issue of, oh my God, if by supporting this just general affirmative statement, am I supporting, 170 donor towns at $400 million? I think, your point, Dave, it looks to me, and I think it is a straightforward point, is to the extent that the non-utility property, right? We want to keep the utility property separately, because that's already been determined. You can have it at a differential rate. To the extent it's used, it's got to be used with the same tax rate across all taxable properties in the state. That's a state property tax, what you mean. And it, and the biggest issue, Dave, is in the state property tax, should there be a type of automatic abatement that says that, that whatever rate is set, whatever extent the property tax is used at, should it be paid by all taxpayers throughout the state, regardless of the town they live in? Our current rule has some communities that have a lot of property wealth base. Their taxpayers actually don't pay the nominal rate. It ends up not collecting that excess property. And I think what you're saying, that's the real issue here. And I think that to me, I could support this because I don't think you're talking about what the rate should be.
No, I'm
I
not.
think implicit in your language, and having talked to you a lot, and by the way, it takes great leadership to write down affirmative principles like this, and I thank you for it. It's how you move to the end of the game, and I really appreciate it. And it's hard to do, but I think you're just saying to the extent it's used. Number one, let's have it be remitted to the state treasury. I think that's a great point, and I think it should be. I think number two, you're saying that there shouldn't be abatements by town. It should be applied. And Chris, this will be the one that will challenge a town of
Right.
Portsmouth, say, but I think as a principle, I'm prepared to support it. I believe that it's mandated by clear decisions. Other decisions I don't think is so clear, by clear decisions that say, look, if it's a state property tax supporting it, you can have reasonable exemptions, but it can't be something that exempts just taxpayers in one town. And that's where I am. So Dave, if you went to the extent used, consistent with those principles, I can support this. Thank
Yeah,
you.
I mean, I think that's fine. I don't know if we would go so far as to say that that the same rate for all taxable property throughout the state, because I think the state does have the ability to set rates differently based on property class, as they've done for utility property.
Yep, sure, I agree with that.
And you know, I don't think the commission is advocating that the state set up different state property tax levels for different, I think there's something like I don't know, when I looked at the CAMA data, there were like, it seemed like more than a dozen different property classes. But all the state's really doing is utility and non-utility from a state property tax standpoint. So I'm really not looking for a principal to take a position on other property classes.
Dave, that's not what Bill's saying, though. Can I
Okay.
interject, though?
Yeah.
I think what Bill is saying, and Bill's going to correct me if I'm wrong, because he always does, is under the current regime, we don't have equal rates for residential property. I'm going to keep picking on Waterville Valley because they're the easiest, because they just come to mind. And by the way, I read the public comment yesterday. I saw Mark Dakota from Waterville Valley join the call. I have great respect for Mark, by the way. I think he's an excellent public servant. And I know and I like him. I think the issues he raised yesterday around enrollment are super interesting, but are sort of neither here nor there for the point of this conversation. I think in my opinion, and I'm curious to hear if Bill agrees with me, the people in Waterville Valley today pay a lower statewide education property tax rate than the people in Concord, because the state buys down the rate in Waterville Valley by allowing Waterville Valley to retain the excess swept raised in town above the calculated cost of adequacy. Therefore, they're paying a different rate. And
I
think
agree
we
with
should
that.
go
That's, John, that was the point that I was focused on.
Mhm.
I agree.
Yeah. So we're not talking about utility, non-utility.
Okay. I just wanted to be clear on that. So
Yeah, ABC property, we're talking about, the so-called donor town issue.
Yep.
And I certainly respect your interest in consensus, Dave, but I'm not confident that we're going to get there
Mhm.
on that issue. But I think it needs to be addressed, very directly and clearly. And I think we need to let the chips fall where they may.
Yep. Well, I mean, I don't think it can be any more direct than how it's laid out in that first bullet. But
I don't think it's very direct, actually, Dave, at all.
really,
I think it's saying the state property tax is going to go to the state. But
it doesn't say that the state can't issue a rebate.
well, I guess what it's saying is the state property tax goes to the state, but we could maintain the status quo with the taxpayers of Waterville Valley paying a lower rate, even under a regime that requires Waterville Valley to first remit the property tax to the state. We could end up in the same place. This bullet, as it's written right now, does not accomplish.
Okay, good. Then
In my.
No. Thank you, John and Bill, for that. This is exactly what I'm hoping to accomplish this morning. So we add, to the extent the state contribution to education is funded through non-utility property, same rate throughout the state. Does that change it, or do we just say, no, the state does not rebate back to municipalities or abate?
So Dave, again, my risk, and this is, you guys have suffered with this, I'm a tax attorney, so I will use too many words. But I think what John is saying, if I get it wrong, and he'll correct me because he always does, and he always is right actually, is that we should not support, and this is where Chris is going to have to, or not just, I'm picking on Chris, I don't mean to. There's a lot of people in this boat, that it shouldn't provide exemptions, reductions, or rebates solely to taxpayers located in a particular municipality. That's the thing that I think John is referring to. And if it's taken to the state level, there shouldn't be some kind of relief mechanism that says for those residents in towns that pay over a certain amount, they get a rebate back or something. And I think that's the principle that I'm thinking about.
Okay.
Because, in other words, taxpayers are not paying the state tax at the same rate.
Right. So,
Dave, this is exactly why I voted against the bill back in 2011, because I think John hit it right on the nail when he said that the state law now currently allows the excess to be paid down. So the tax rate, the statewide tax rate, is not equal
right.
throughout the state. But there's several principles here. I don't want to get confused in this matter. The one that we're addressing right now, that as modified both by John and Bill and whomever, there's another one of implementation. And the implementation of this cost is going to maybe be a blow if we try to implement it all at once. I can remember when we had 709 originally, or at one point,
Yeah.
with all the amendments.
All right. Hang on, Rick, because this is a 2-hour meeting and we've got a lot to get through.
Yeah.
We're not taking on implementation.
Okay.
Did we? I don't even.
Well, we ratcheted it down over a period of time.
Yeah, and obviously the legislature is going to have work to do on this, but these are key principles. So we add to this first bullet, the state should not provide exemptions or rebates to taxpayers only in certain municipalities.
Dave, can I say something?
Yep, please, Dick. Sorry about that.
The first thing is I'm a little concerned about how this discussion is going, because it's sort of whoever jumps in and speaks is the way it's steered. And so there's no order to it. I think it would be better if a little more control was exercised. And I will say that I agree with the principle with Bill's correction. I think that's a good correction. And with the proviso that there's no direct abatement or rebate, whatever you want to call it, to taxpayers from the funds that are in the state treasury, that come into the state treasury. Worded in a way that doesn't get in the way of a good education funding formula, by the way. But with that change, I think this is fine. The tax should be collected. It should locally, and it should be sent to the state treasury. Education trust fund might be specified there. It's up to you. And then I would actually put as a sub piece of this principle your next bullet, which is about the whatever you call it, the property tax relief program, because that's an integral part of this, and we should speak to that as a part of what we're speaking to here. So I would add that feature to what we say about the state property tax.
So, all right. So is everybody, and you don't have to be endorsing this. Is it okay the way Jordan has it here in terms of, and maybe we'll have to tighten it up a little bit, but with this concept, bringing it forward next week.
Dave, just to chime, if Jordan could do what Dick just said, which is indent the next bullet,
Right.
because that bullet is
Exactly.
really a subset of the very first lead sentence.
Yeah,
Right.
don't do it yet. Well, I wanted to challenge that.
Okay,
Okay.
Dick's points.
Yeah, let me just challenge that really quickly. So let's say that that at the end of the day, either the commission or the legislature decides not to make any change to how the state property tax is collected and abated. Would that then nullify any reason to move forward with a taxpayer equity targeted to homeowners, renters through low, moderate? I mean, doesn't that stand alone?
I think you would still want something like that because it might mean that the thresholds were different or the shape of such legislation were different. But I think the pieces go together, which is part of my objection in the first place, that once you start pulling these things apart, first of all, you lose consensus, but I think the whole first bullet is predicated on being able to do something for relief. Otherwise, basically, we've shut the door on families in our state in many places.
So would it and so we're sort of still on the first bullet, but transitioning to the second bullet. Would it be appropriate then to have a sub bullet under the first one saying, you know, a comprehensive targeted property tax relief program, implementation of a targeted taxpayer relief program, and then let this bullet sort of talk about that?
I mean,
Would
I
that be all right? All right.
think that's what everybody's saying.
Okay. Well,
You're just wanting to make a separation of the detail.
I do, because I think that's something that I've had constituents call me about long before we started the school funding commission. So,
Dave, before we move on.
Yeah.
I think the second sub bullet, the state should not provide exemption rebates. I know I'm picking a painful scab here. I just think it should be a little more direct and clear. Because if you read that statement sort of in isolation, somebody might say the state provides exemptions only to people in certain municipalities. You know, I would say effectively the state does. Everybody on their own property tax bill pays the same equalized rate. This is so complicated, as Bill knows. Tax policy is just awful. It takes a masochist to want to work in it. But I think we could be a little more explicit here, and I just came up with some language. Perhaps it could be softer, but something to the effect of the state should end the practice or no longer provide additional grants to municipalities that in the aggregate raise statewide property tax revenue in excess of the calculated cost of adequacy in that town or municipality. That's what we're doing. We're taxing at an equalized rate on a statewide level for the statewide property tax, which translates into a local rate based on local valuations. And the people in Waterville Valley and the people in Concord pay the same rate. But then the state effectively grants Waterville Valley additional cash, that excess swept. Therefore, the people in Waterville Valley are allowed to raise less local property tax for education purposes. And it's the combined local and state rate that is together subsidized.
Right. That doesn't seem like a principle. It seems like an implication of the current system, right? It's an explanation that, is a good explanation, but it feels like an explanation of the opposite of what the principle is doing to further explicate it, but it doesn't feel like a principle for a new system.
How, with apologies to Representative Ames for jumping in, how is what I said not a principle, but the second sub-bullet is?
Well, I
guess I'm
think
just trying to expand on that.
Yeah, I think we haven't really talked about the second sub-bullet yet, and I think Dave was starting to try to make it more into a principle by making it the implementation would be accompanied by strategies to address low and moderate income.
I don't.
That's what I heard him trying to do.
Yeah. So some thoughts on this. I think we all understand what the intention is for state property tax to be sent to the state treasury and not to provide excess swept rebates to taxpayers living in municipalities where there's excess swept. I think we can probably craft some language on that so that we can keep this meeting moving, and maybe if any of you have more specific language you'd like to do on it, send it. You've got the document, and Jordan and I can put it all together. Again, this isn't the final stop for this stuff. So yeah, Dick.
Yeah, I think that's fine. I think you're taking it back and ensuring that the language is consistent with what I think is the consensus, which is 1, collect locally, send to the state, and 2, no return of what has been sent to the state to provide direct taxpayer relief. In some municipalities, call it excess funds that have been received, whatever you want to call it. But
well, I don't want it to interfere with the targeted low moderate property tax. We don't want it to interfere with that. We want
you word that appropriately. And then the third thing is that should be there, and you can shorthand this if you want, and that is that the state should, as part of its use of this tax, improve the existing program that provides low and moderate homeowners with relief, perhaps by extending it to renters, or something like that.
Okay,
but you can do it in shorthand if as long as you pick.
Let's do it in shorthand right now. Jordan, can you add a third sub bullet about the improving the low moderate property tax relief program for homeowners and renters?
And maybe you want to pick up the provide property tax, what do you call it, deferral? The deferral you got. Do you call it a property tax referral program? You didn't mean to do that.
That's just a typo. That's a typo. I think he meant deferral.
Yeah, it's deferral. Yeah. Ugh. Bug just sorry. It's that time of season. All right. So I think we got some stuff to work with here. sort of pushing through the next bullet. Do we agree on are we ready to settle on to support a principle for a targeted taxpayer equity to homeowners and renters through an improved low and moderate income property tax relief program? Updated limits. The limits are way out of whack. There's been multiple attempts over the last several sessions to change them. I don't think they've gotten anywhere. And then to look down the road to introduce a property tax deferral program managed by the state. I put in here for 55 plus residents, just to put some sort of qualification level in there, and show that the program is really directed to not necessarily the same people that the low moderate relief program would be directed to.
Dave, what's meant by with limited cash flow?
I think that's the whole idea.
Yeah, but can you define it better than limited cash flow? I could limit my cash flow.
Yeah. So Rick, no, and that's fine. We're not crafting, law on this. We're trying to set, general principles. We could take out the with limited cash flow, but I think that's the whole idea. Is that these people that have significant property wealth and potentially a significant state property tax obligation may find it difficult, given their circumstances, to pay that local property tax, and that shouldn't be held against the municipality, and it shouldn't be overlaid on top of, to other property taxpayers. Dick.
I'm still hung up on why this is a separate bullet. It seems to me it's already addressed in the prior one.
Yeah.
The reason it's a separate bullet is because I think it also has an independent element from the first one, because there's people who are interested in doing this even under the existing situation. Bill.
On that point, I think the thing that brings both positions together is that, certainly me and maybe others say, if there's a state property tax, I think the state property tax should have low and moderate, not just income, but income and net worth, low and moderate income and net worth property tax relief support. I definitely think that. I think a state property tax without that is not a good policy from only my view. But, as we're not there yet, but I still believe there's going to be a significant role, I believe, for the local governed property tax. And I also believe that low and moderate net worth and income relief should be included as part of the locally governed property tax process, which is distinct from the state property tax. So, maybe Dave, what you're referring to is you want a separate bullet because you want to make it clear that this low and moderate income and net worth relief program, both circuit breaker and deferral, should apply both to the state property tax, which is the subject of the first grand bullet, and to the locally governed property tax. And I would support that too. So it's a separate bullet in that context because the first bullet's only dealing with state property tax.
So Bill, I think that's an excellent point. The question I have though would be, why would the state be obligated to put a to put such a program in place to essentially rebate local property taxes that were voted on at the local level as opposed to the state level. I don't even know how the state would go about budgeting for that. Now I'm just putting this out there as a question. The other thing is the local municipalities have provisions on the books right now for providing abatements and exemptions, and we've had testimony on that, and they can apply those as generously as they would like, but it creates a higher burden on
Right.
other people in those municipalities.
And
Chris,
just-
you're
Well,
Chris,
we don't
hang on,
have it.
Chris, go ahead.
We don't have enabling legislation that allows us to do that other than for particular classes.
Yeah.
Disabled, et cetera. So if you, a low-income family that isn't disabled and isn't over a certain age, there isn't enabling legislation. That's a small point within this larger point
Yep.
here. So if you did intend that, it would be important to have it be separate. And in that case, for the reason that Bill raised, the deferral program could be managed by the state in the way that paper that we received described a program to do that, where you might not want the first sentence to be rebated by the state, but the second might be a state managed piece. If we're going to kind of get into that level of detail, again, I kind of agree with what Dick raised. Maybe these are not principles, but these are implications of that third bullet in the first one. I think we have to kind of figure out what we're talking about as principles here, so we don't keep getting into that circular argument. But this is an explanatory level of detail about how you would go about thinking about that third bullet, unless you do believe that that we could do local exemptions that would be funded by the state.
And definitely do that. That's how other states, as Chris, as you mentioned, in both pieces that were reviewed by the Fiscal Policy Committee, one of the recommendations of a good circuit breaker program, and those were not talking about state property taxes, they were talking about the property tax that's locally governed, is that the state should have skin in the game to finance those things, because otherwise the people who are eligible, it's just not in the town's interest to market these. And to some extent, our current programs suffer from that. There has to be state support for it, which is covered, frankly, in part by Dave's draft. I don't think it should be limited, Dave, to just the state property tax, because I actually think we could not have a state property tax at all, and there'd still be a very compelling case to be made that we need low and moderate net income, net worth relief, whether, in an integrated program. So that's how I'm reconciling this bullet problem.
Okay, so why don't we be a little bit more, and John, I see your hand up too, but why don't we be a little bit more explicit in here that the state should consider both the relief on the state property tax as well as local property taxes. And yeah, the only reason I challenged that was just to make sure that we were considering the the difference between the state property tax and local property taxes when it comes to budget. It's not that I disagree with that at all. I absolutely agree with it. We've had people here in Hopkinton say that, hey, I don't mind paying a little more so that somebody else can pay a little less, even. So I think people understand that. Sorry, John, you had a hand up.
I just wanted to echo Bill's statement that local property tax relief should also be state funded. I'm not a big fan of, I'm not one of those people you've heard from, Dave, who wants to pay more so others can pay less in Hopkinton. I think local property tax exemptions are probably a little more aggressive already than they should be. And to the extent the state wants to lessen the burden of property tax, it should do it on a statewide basis and not just grant the ability to towns, because it can get a little out of hand in individual towns.
Yeah, and I think this, yeah, that makes sense. So, all right, so we can come up with some language for that. Jordan, Bill?
I just wanted, you have the 55 plus, at the risk of getting my head handed to me by 200,000 very active elderly people. I don't support having any of this low and moderate net income, net worth relief programs if the only eligibility requirement is that you're elderly, that's not enough.
No.
So I really want to make that clear.
Yeah.
If it's elderly plus satisfy low and moderate net worth, net income, then that's absolutely within the scope of something. But so sorry to raise that.
No, that's fine. There was no intention that 55 plus be a limiting factor on the low moderate relief program. I'd put it in there as part of the property tax deferral program because that's actually how it's presently defined, except it's only enabled to be done at a local level, and it's called the elderly. What is it called, Bill?
Exemption.
No, I know. Yeah. It is clear to me that the current statutory provisions for both the circuit breaker and the deferral program in New Hampshire are flawed. They should be revised and brought up to best practices in my personal view. So I don't really think that they actually do a good job on that.
Okay, so are you suggesting that on the tax deferral program that there not be an age qualification?
That would be my suggestion, but I'm not going to die on it because of the way you qualified it. But
I just put it in there for discussion purposes. Okay. I don't even think that we need to be specific on that.
I want it to be firm. I think that elderly homeowners benefit tremendously from good public schools. The value of their home is higher, their community is more robust, and so to have limitations based on age for this kind of tax policy, I don't support as one person.
I agree.
Okay, so the language that's there is an improvement. Dick?
Yes, it is.
All right.
I'm not.
Okay.
Sure.
No.
No, I kind of like the age in there and plus other, but I have some concerns that some of these municipalities are so unique. The property values are not high because of education. It might be high because you got a ski area right there with a large hotel and a demand for condos, and on it goes. So I guess if you put draft on top of all this stuff, Dave, and let us think about it after we see all these changes and we come back and deal with it at our next meeting, I'd feel more comfortable.
Well, I mean, I think the plan is that we're going to talk about them next week at the commission meeting.
Yeah, but I thought that at the very beginning, Dick Ames asked, what is the time frame for us coming to closure as a working subgroup? Is today that day we're going to come to closure on all these things? Or are we going to we're hitting this really for the first time. And we've talked on and off, but this is the first time it's been a topic for discussion. Can we get these changes, let's say, are highlighted in yellow or whatever color that Jordan wants to highlight them in? and get them, and then we come back at another time and quickly go through them again, and it wouldn't probably be quickly. We can't do anything quickly here as a group. That's the question I have, Dave.
Can I take that under advisement, Rick? Because I need to take a look at the schedule. And there's obviously a lot of things in between now and December 1st that we've got to do. But I appreciate the comment. I think it makes a lot of sense, Rick, because I like to, dwell on things and
if
it
we're
gives them-
talking to Dr. Ranzulli down at the University of Connecticut, who's in charge of the talented gifted program, he'd say sometimes it takes 20 to 30 minutes for even bright people to engage, to really get through that thinking process. Is that right, Bill?
Okay, I'm gonna take that under advisement, but I think you make a good point, Rick. So can we keep moving? Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, we're starting to get into the fun stuff now. Again, these are for they are starting points for discussion. One of the things that I think we saw from Daphne Kenyon's presentation, and I think it was contained in the report that she authored with respect to school funding and property taxes. And one of the points that she drives home is that not to start with a defining a state local share and then moving on from that. I thought it was a very comprehensive report that she drafted. It is a little out of date. It's 2007. She's working on a new one, but thinking that that the state share of education funding should be driven by consideration for student equity, and there's a lot of room for interpretation in what that means. What do people, Dick?
Well, just a short suggestion. I think this is a appropriate principle, except I think it's by consideration for student and taxpayer equity. I think it's both elements. I think that, getting back to Mary Heath's concern at the beginning, that we are starting sort of in the middle of these principles and we don't have sort of the overlay. Well, the overlay is a finding by AIR that the existing system is fundamentally inequitable from both a taxpayer and a student perspective. And so this principle speaks to that. And I think it's both.
So no, I agree with you, Dick, on that. But actually, Dr. Kenyon points out that that taxpayer equity really is addressed through circuit breaker programs as opposed to the funding mechanism. And so, but I'm glad you put that in there, because this is exactly the type of discussion I was hoping we'd have on this. Bill, I see your hand.
Yes, I don't understand the practical, tangible, concrete meaning of this bullet. Can you give me an example using kind of some of the numbers that we've used? What does this mean? Like, if you support this principle, what does it actually mean in the development of a proposal? I can't tell.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. So I've played around with spreadsheets on this, and I think you can demonstrate that where the state share is at different percentages, could be 100%, could be 50%, could be could be something else, that where student equity is is there. I think you can also show that at different percentages, 100%, 50%, other percentages, that student equity is not realized. And Bill, you brought up a good point with me earlier, that without consideration of the distribution of costs through the estimated cost model, that a funding mechanism by itself also doesn't assure student equity.
The languages that we're using is really, we're at a time, you're distinguishing, I heard in your answer, between taxing mechanisms that are used to fund distribution mechanisms, which are appropriation. So you've got two concepts and we don't want to muddle them.
Mm-hmm.
In this particular statement, I still don't know what you mean. Is this, for example, the state share of education funding, is that the portion of total spending
That's what I mean.
statewide? You know,
Oh,
that
sure.
is funded. I don't know what you mean.
Yeah. That was shorthand for that. That's exactly what I was getting
Yeah.
at. So I mean, what you know, if you knock off the federal part, what is typically considered the state share and the local share, and I think, you know, currently that's that what is it, the 32-68 split that we currently have. That's what I'm referring to.
And so what are you saying about the 32% split, if we've got that down in the sentence, driven by consideration for student equity? The sentence isn't holding together. And again, slap me in the face, I'm a stinking tax lawyer, which is horrible, but I don't know what that means. So 32.8%, if that's the proportion of the state financing proportion, do you mean should be driven by consideration, or is, wait, I see it. What do you mean?
All right. What I really what I think I was getting at with this is that picking an arbitrary state share doesn't really matter. Maybe we can get rid of the whole bullet, and that's fine too, dropping it. But you know,
Are you saying that the higher the state share, the more likely it is that you've taken equity, you have the resources to take equity into account?
I don't think it's trying to say that. I think it's trying to give sort of fair consideration that a state share doesn't have to be 100% of spending, and can as long as it results in student, as long as you've got student equity in place. But maybe that's, I mean, it's here for discussion. So,
Yeah.
you know, the just sort of jumping forward to the next two bullets just for a second.
Right. They're really related.
They are all related. These
I think this is Mary Heath's first point.
Yeah. And so we may be better off putting our time not on this bullet that we're working on, but on the next two. What do people think on that?
Sure.
Just from a discussion.
I agree.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm for that.
So let's table the one we're on right now and dig in on the next one. So the next one, student equity can be achieved with the first last dollar funding of the cost of an adequate education. I'm just going to throw this up in the air. Bill, do you want to knock the ball first?
I'd be happy to, but I defer to others. I mean, this is obviously something that I've asked for, to have a discussion about this first and last dollar so-called rule. My views are not going to surprise anybody here.
Right.
I think that the sentence is undermined by just a simple logical point. If your distribution formula, this is kind of towards Mary Heath's thing, says that we're going to take whatever state funding we have and we're going to distribute it on a flat per pupil basis across the entire state, to me, that's not student equity.
Yep.
In other words, you can have 100% state share, $3 billion, and you can produce horribly inequitable results. Because what matters first is not the state budget share versus the local budget share. What matters first is that you're focusing, like AIR, on the distribution of resources committed to public education. So to me, the first concern I have with this bullet is that I think it's not accurate. What matters is the distribution, not the first and last dollar rule. Second,
and when you say distribution, Bill, you mean the distribution of estimated costs for equitable
I mean
outcomes.
the distribution of appropriated spending on public education. So I'm not talking about the source of funds, whether it's a property tax locally governed, state tax locally state governed. I don't care about that. Raise the money, and the way you achieve equity is through a formula that appropriates the money to local school districts.
Okay, so that's the next bullet. John, go ahead.
I agree with what Bill just said 100%, and I think we should lead with that, which is regardless of whether it is a so-called first dollar, last dollar, or a targeted distribution formula. I think what we're saying is we need to get away from every town gets $5,000 ahead. That
Right.
It needs, regardless of whether it's a big program or a little program, or we would be okay with a formula that sends $1,000 to this town per kid and $10,000 to that town per kid, because that would effectuate equitable educational outcomes. And so while I have the mic, I would say I do believe the Supreme Court has interpreted the Constitution to say that we have a first dollar, last dollar requirement. It doesn't say those words, but I think it's in the Londonderry case, where the Supreme Court says you got to cost it out, you got to pay for the whole thing. So I think that's first dollar, last dollar, but I'm willing to support a targeted program because I think the Supreme Court has been incredibly weak on this issue for the last 20 years. And I would not kill myself to maintain fidelity to the Londonderry decision when the Supreme Court hasn't required us to maintain fidelity to the Londonderry decision. It was a dozen years ago, and education funding's still totally broken, in my opinion.
Yep. So John, I agree with everything you just said there. The way this bullet reads, it doesn't say student equity will be achieved. It says it can be achieved with first last dollar funding of the cost of an adequate education. The cost of an adequate education is a principle that Jay's work group is going to be talking about. But I agree with everything you just said, that the cost of an adequate education is not uniform for every district and every student in that district. And AIR's research and report for New Hampshire bears that out. Similarly, the two straw man examples that they gave for funding, one of them showed the state providing first and last dollar, using of 100% of the estimated cost model specific to each town, each district via their member towns across the state. And I certainly would support, you know, if we're gonna be moving forward with this bullet, having some clarification on that. But the principle here is whether or not first last dollar funding can be demonstrated to achieve student equity. And I believe the AIR strawman examples have shown that. Not saying that that's where the commission lands in terms of a recommendation, but as a principle, first last dollar seems to be able, certainly can achieve it. And the next bullet, I think we consider targeted. Yeah, Bill.
Can I finish?
Sorry about being worried.
I think I disagree that the AIR model, here's what I agree with John. There's language in various court decisions that suggests that the court actually may have meant that the state budget has to fund 100% of the cost of an adequate education everywhere for every child. That's the Londonary was the most aggressive language. I'm not going to comment on what the court said or didn't say. But as a matter of policy, I believe that a system that had 100% state financing of, say, $3 billion total cost, let's just use that as a hypo, would dramatically harm the quality and spending on public schools in New Hampshire. And I base that on the fact that I think 100% state financing will undermine local control, because state financing, it's been proven in like California that Jesse Levin talked about, comes with strings attached that slowly undermine our local principals, our local superintendents, and local citizenry. I think also it undermines it because if it's all at the state budget level, the next fiscal crisis, what people have shown is the first thing that gets cut is the public education commitment. And that's what happened in California too, where California went from top 10 in quality and spending to bottom 10 since their Serrano v. Priest decision, which was construed as a similar way. So I just want to, all of you, this is my final pitch on this. I will never again mention it. I've submitted to the record of this meeting a 3-page explanation of my position. And I cannot, in my view, you know, I'm looking at something else. With this rule, first and last dollar and a state property tax, the donor town so-called problem becomes for 170 towns at $400 million. In the AIR examples that they gave us, that's what it tallied. I broke it out. So I think this rule, it would be something that disregards a good policy, locally governed property taxation, where local government not only decides how to spend on public education, but also has to have skin in the game with their neighbors to make good decisions, that produces vesting of the public in public school enterprise, that produces better public schools, generally higher spending. And I think that our current status in like Massachusetts has 38% going upwards to 40, maybe 41, you know, over 10 years. So I think that's my position on this. I can't support any statement that first and last dollar rule will produce better equity or better quality or better spending. I just disagree. Thank you.
Okay.
Sorry, guys.
Okay. No, that's fine. I think you've laid out your case really well. Jay, I see Senator Khan's joined the meeting and has his hand up. So Jay.
I gotta follow that.
Yeah,
No, I don't think that this bulleted point is going to help. And it's because what's above it is talking about state spending, and this is talking about every dollar being spent. And I'm getting confused when I see this statement. And it creates the same kind of conflict for me as Bill articulated it's creating for him. Yeah, I think we are posing policies that don't line up with the first and last dollar rulings.
we say that again. We are what?
I think the policies we're proposing relative to state spending are not in line with the court's decisions about, if there was ever a court statement that definitively said first and last dollar, I don't think the rest of our statements line up with that.
The rest of our statements.
What's above, what we've just talked about state spending be driven by student and taxpayer equity.
No, we actually have tabled that one. So that one may be dropping.
But the others as well. I don't support this principle, and I don't think that this statement, you could almost put a not in there, and I'd agree with it more.
Well, it's fine. I mean, we can, the whole idea today was to hash it out, clarify wording, and add drop things. So if this is going to drop, that's fine. But if it's going, the statement by itself says that equity can be achieved with first last dollar. Bill's point, I believe, is not that I'm sure, I think he's making the case that the court also didn't say first last dollar, and they certainly didn't use those words. But
I'm not speaking on legal opinions.
Okay.
I'm part of a legislative commission, and the legislature has, imagine this. Imagine you were a legislator and you were facing a court decision like Plessy v. Ferguson. There's nothing in the Constitution requires a legislator or a legislative commission not to criticize a bad policy court rule. Now, you have to comply with it because what the court says is the law, but that doesn't mean you can't say it would be bad policy. And I want to be clear on my position on that. Thank you.
Yeah, and sorry, Bill, I wasn't trying to put words in your mouth there, but what I was going to get at is that I think I heard you say that your belief that having local skin, having local dollars in the game leads to better student equity.
Yes, my model, my perfect model that I think is a best practices model is like Massachusetts. And Massachusetts has a substantial role for the locally governed property tax. It also has an integrated total school spending approach that has both local tax, but their percentage is 38.7 going to up to 40 something. So I particularly like that. But a first and last dollar rule would render Massachusetts and New Jersey and basically every other state unconstitutional. And I just can't see that that makes any sense.
Okay, so that's not what this bullet is about. The bullet is about whether first last dollar funding of the cost of an adequate education can achieve student equity. It's not about should it be first last dollar. It's about whether first last dollar can achieve student equity.
I can answer the question. If you have a decent distribution formula, appropriation formula, then it could. But without that qualifier, this statement is not sensical.
Then I'm okay putting that qualifier in there because, well, I think it's can, so it's not saying it does, but I'm happy putting that qualifier in there because right now, if we argue that the state is paying first and last dollar of an adequate education, which I believe it is from the cost of adequacy formula, it is certainly not resulting in student equity, right? We all agree with that.
Even if we believe that student equity could theoretically be achieved with the first dollar funding, is it a principle that we're building on? And if it isn't, then I don't know why we would want to put it in here. I agree, theoretically, it's, with all the caveats we've talked about, you could do it, but it doesn't sound like it's a principle we're building on.
Well, I think it's really up to the legislature to put forward bills and I think there's wouldn't we prefer to work with the next principle about how student equity could best be achieved with targeted funding plus. Well, that's why it's in there.
Rather than
so why don't we
a competing piece in here, kind of get into the next bullet, which seems closer to where we are to, refine the next bullet. Because isn't it up to us to kind of say how we think it could best be achieved based on all the learnings we've done?
I think the more we get to that, the better off, the more useful the report is, for sure. I don't think we need to necessarily write legislation, but all right, why don't we do this? Why don't we table the two bullets above it, the one that says the proportion and the one that goes with an appropriate distribution system? We'll table those. Is that what I'm hearing, people? That we want to move on to the next one?
That makes sense to me.
Jay? Yeah?
Yes.
Okay. I'm glad we spent time on these. So it's supposed to be messy. And it's tough to do this remotely. This is more fun to do around a table. All right, so we're on to the next one. Jay, you've got a hand up, or is your hand still up? You're muted.
Lowered.
Lowered, okay. So who would like to take a crack at the next one? Dick?
Yeah, I would want to expand this. And my thought is that, and I'll just read out what I wrote, then you can attack it. Student equity can be achieved with 1, an adequate education formula based on appropriate weights for student need that is targeted to ensure that all students achieve adequate outcomes. And 2, that is designed to counter taxpayer inequities that arise due to unequal evaluations in municipalities. So you got 2 pieces there. We have to keep in sight what we're trying to do, which is develop an adequate education formula. That's one side of our task, and the second side is to fund it. And maybe that first side will be adequately addressed somewhere else in this list of principles, but I'd like to see it included here as a predicate to ensuring that whatever we have in that formula is not undermined by the uneven valuations that exist in our across municipalities.
You're talking about the fiscal disparities.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I would stay clear of the mandatory minimum, the local mandatory minimum. That's a Massachusetts concept that I'm not sure we perfectly understand.
Mhm. Whether we phrase it that way, I think it's a separate bullet that has to do with what Bill was talking about earlier about the combination of local and state. But I think separating it out from this statement of that you're trying to get at is clearer.
Yeah. So
I always want to, in addition to student need, remember community characteristic. I think the piece that came out yesterday about size, looking at the weights by size is really an important piece that I think we got sent last night that does show that you've got to look, and I'm not sure community characteristic is the right terminology for it, but you've got to look at size of school, size of district within this, in addition to demographic characteristics. It isn't only student need, it's other characteristics that have gone into this, figuring out this formula. So that's a minor point to the overall, but I think we don't want to, if we're making principles, we don't want to forget that aspect.
are you talking about from the costing side or from the targeted funding?
Well,
Chris?
if you're targeting funding in the way that Dick was bringing in what the components of targeting are, it isn't only student need, it's other characteristics as well that you are making your targets on. That's where the size of district came in.
Right.
And I think they really proved in what the paper they sent last night, that just based on the formula, we've got to consider that in our state, or we'll be really screwing up the other weights.
All right. So I'm just trying to see how that fits into this bullet. Because it sounds like what you're talking about, Chris, is the estimated costs take into consideration community characteristics.
That's right. In the same way that Dick talked about targeting funding takes in student need into account, it also takes in community characteristics. It's just a small point.
Okay, I guess I've sort of broken this down in my head as having, two parts to it. There's the I think Bill calls it the distribution part. I call it the estimated cost part, but it's different for every school district or for every city and town by virtue of their school districts.
Right.
And that takes into account community characteristics. And then there's a targeted funding part, or a funding part, which
that's right.
Which is to do this. So both are providing both are addressing disparities. The funding one is addressing fiscal disparities. The estimated cost one is addressing community characteristics, low income cost needs, demographics, needs of students, stuff like that.
Yes.
So I'm trying to separate these two things so that we're not so that we're not so that we're addressing those characteristics. We're not like double addressing those characteristics, I guess.
Okay.
Is what I'm saying. So
Dave, are you now, I'm struggling here a little bit. I guess I'm looking too much.
Thanks, Rick, because so am I.
No, great. Under 198 40A, the cost of an opportunity for an adequate education. We talk about what we have called base adequacy right now, the 34 or 37, whatever you want to call it, the 3709 now, plus all these targeted components which we direct to either to English language learner, to special education, to free and reduced. That to me is targeted money. And I see us right now then providing this 3709 to all kids. But we're also within this umbrella definition of costing of an opportunity inclusive of targeting. So why are we now trying to separate them out? I think we ought to be just, if we need to target money to help, small schools, I'm not necessarily agreeing on small schools, but on these various weighted components, I'm supported that. I'm just getting a little confused here.
Yeah, so I guess the costs that would be estimated to provide education for comparable outcomes for every district taken to currently under AIR's research in the model they presented, take into account the characteristics or the need, the needs and the costs associated with those needs for free and reduced lunch as a proxy for poverty, English language learning, special education, school size, elementary, middle, and high school grades. Am I missing any factors? And it does not take into account on the costing side, the cost distribution does not take into consideration equalized value per pupil.
That's right.
It doesn't take into consideration, I'm making stuff up, miles that buses have
That's
to
right.
drive. It's not taking into consideration,
Right.
these things. So what I'm trying to say is, what I'm trying to suggest here is that the cost model and the funding model, because they're two different things, don't overlap in terms of what they consider. That a funding model looks at equalized valuation per pupil. The costing model looks at all of the other characteristics that go into the cost of education for whatever outcome it is that we decide. Because honestly, a community, and John started off picking on Waterville Valley, but I think we've seen that the cost of education in Waterville Valley is actually really high because of the characteristics of that community, including all the different disparities that I laid out. That is completely different from their fiscal capacity.
Right, Dave, what you just said, I think, is a principle. I think it's important to have a principle that distinguishes the costing model and the funding model, if you want to say it that way. That's a principle that we need to understand. So I would kind of lead with something like that, that's very clear and straightforward, and then get into how you could achieve student equity.
Chris, could you use a concrete, tangible example of exactly what you're talking about in the difference between a costing model and a funding model? Because it's not jumping out at me. I'm viewing the two differences. There's taxes you got to raise, and then there's appropriations where you just divide up the money.
But first, there's the figuring out what it should cost by community based on student characteristics and district characteristics. I think we don't want to lose that, because that's a bedrock part of the AIR report. I mean, that's a foundational piece here to understand that others approaching this may not have realized, because they may not be thinking about, oh, it costs more to educate students with higher needs. So I think that's what Dave is trying to make clear here before we get to how we fund that.
Well, okay, but so I'm thinking that's kind of, you're talking about, let's decide how much per pupil to spend in Manchester, or should be totally spent in Manchester, and that differs from what should be totally spent in Bedford because of the differences in student characteristics, geographic size. That's great.
That's right.
But those are all really appropriation concepts, because what you're talking about is how to, whatever funds you raise, however you raise them, you're going to divide that pie up in that. So I'm saying, well, a cost model is used to help determine how to share the total pie.
Yeah,
And so
yeah.
Dick's comment, which I agreed with at the beginning, was kind of saying, look, one thing you've got to do with your distribution of resources is you've got to fix any inequities that may result as the result of, say, local property tax usage. You know, one of the things you got to solve is if one community has 8 times the tax base as another community, state aid should pour into the community that needs help to equalize the amount. They've got plenty of tax power in the first community. They don't need a lot of state aid. So the question is,
right, but you're fixing those inequities not only based on their equalized valuation, you're fixing those inequities based on their population.
and I agree with that. If Dick's comment I was going to add is about, let's just focus on the differentials that are produced by differences in local property tax base, for example, I'd say, no, I think the distribution needs to be made in a way that considers other things, but also certainly the differentials in local property tax base. But I don't, Dick, I don't know if your comment was, I may be missing something here, that you were focused only, I heard you wrong maybe. You weren't just focused on equalized valuation differences as something that needed to be corrected with state aid distributions. You were focused on, were you focused on broader issues like Chris is laying out?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I mean, there's 2 things. There's the amount that you Bill, you use the word appropriate, which is appropriate, but I'm just using the word cost. What's an estimated cost, and that you're distributing state funds in a way that allows these school districts to meet that estimated cost. And so the estimated cost in Bedford is less than the estimated cost in Manchester on a per pupil basis. Similarly, and I think it was raised at a meeting a few weeks ago, and I'm not looking at it, so I could be wrong on this, but the estimated cost per pupil in Claremont is less than the estimated cost per pupil in Waterville Valley. Right? I mean, it was something like that. I think Iris brought it up. But the estimated cost per pupil has got nothing to do with the fiscal capacity of a town, the equalized property value, let's say, of a town. And so I think under this bullet here, you're I think implying that the state, despite the fact that Waterville Valley might have a higher estimated cost per pupil, that the state may be distributing more state dollars to Claremont that has a lower estimated cost per pupil than it would be to Waterville Valley.
I completely agree with that.
Okay, I mean, I think that's what the intent of this is. And I agree, it's hard to put all of this stuff into a bullet, certainly on, and I didn't want to overcook things going into today. I wanted us to do the cooking on things, you know what I mean? So Jordan, do you, or Dick? And I see Jay's got his hand up again too, so.
Okay, well, yeah, I just a few words. I think that the given is that we're going to come up with a formula that takes into account student needs and community characteristics that we consider the appropriate distribution of funds to enable achievement of what we define as the objective, the definition of an adequate education for every child. And that's going to be more for some places and less for other places based on need and characteristics. That is what needs to be funded. That's the given. Now, on the other side, if we lived in a place where every dollar of the state's funding was going to come from, let's say, a combination of a broad-based income tax and a broad-based sales tax, every dollar, then end of conversation, those dollars would fund that formula. We wouldn't be talking about equalized valuation, but we are, because that's not the world we live in. We live in a world that substantially depends on the property tax. And the property tax is a tax on property that happens to be within borders of municipalities. So our job is to make sure that the funding of that formula is not disrupted by that reality of our dependence on property taxes and the uneven harvesting of revenue that results from that. So as long as we can say something like that, I'm fine with it. And our job on the funding side is to devise sources of funding, identify sources of funding, perhaps adjusted by grants that take into account fiscal capacity, so that we still are funding those educational programs consistent with that formula. We got the formula, the funding. It's going to provide more money to some places, probably to a lot more money to Manchester as a formula. Now we have to fund it. How do we fund it? And that's where I think you're trying to get to in this bullet. But let's keep in mind that we've got the first. That's the given. That's the bedrock. I think Chris used some word like that. And then let's work on the funding side of it and make sure our formula doesn't mess it up by failing to account for and counter the irregularities in our municipal property tax basis.
So Dick, the only thing I would say on that though is I'm not sure I understood the first part where you said the distribution wouldn't matter based on, or the targeting of funds wouldn't matter based on let's say equalized value per pupil, because it doesn't really matter where the revenues come from the state revenue comes from, whether that's from the state property tax or
I was staying away from the state property tax.
But just looking at two bins right now, state property tax, which we've got, and other revenues, not the state property tax, which we've got. So those two things get mashed together. That becomes state revenue, wherever that all comes from. And unless you're doing first last dollar, and I don't want to open up that again for the discussion. Unless you're doing first last dollar, you're doing something different. You're either giving everybody the same at a lower amount, or you're targeting based on some sort of fiscal capacity.
Dick was trying to give an analogy. Let's say everybody had the same equalized wealth, but their demographics were different. You would still need to target. So, let's say Portsmouth and Rye have the same equalized valuation, but we have a lot more poor kids and we have English learners. You'd still need to target, right? I mean, so I think Dick was just trying to kind of say,
okay. Yeah.
All things being equal, you'd still need to target.
Based on the costs.
Well, yeah, because it doesn't matter, where that source of money is coming from, you'd still need to target.
And following on that, Dick used an example of non-property tax, But the fact is, an income tax or a sales tax also can be computed in a way that would evaluate donor towns. Because in fact, neither income nor sales are equally distributed around the state. So the same issue exists in these structures. The reality is you got to choose a mix of revenues. Like right now we use the business enterprise tax. I guarantee you there's more businesses located in Manchester and Portsmouth than they are in Rick's community. And so the fact is there's disequities in the way that those revenues are coming out of towns,
Right.
but it's going into the state budget. And at that point, the question is, how do you use state budget dollars in a way that address policy goals that take into account the local districts that you're using to deliver education? And one of those things that AIR has identified are so critical, but also as what this bullet is drafted, the differences in, if you're using a local property tax as one part of your funding source for the total spending, that may have aspects that you have to address, like low and moderate taxpayer relief, or like equalized valuation differences among communities. So to me, I think there's a mix of things that need to be thought about with how you're dividing state aid, how you're dividing total spending as a system.
Bill, how do we deal with these policy goals that you referenced? As a local district, I might decide that these 60 kids are going to be educated in my town, and we're going to have to support all the support services in my school, my building, operational costs, when there's another school of the same grade levels, but with more kids and sustainable in the neighboring town, which is not more than 8 miles away. Are we as a state going to start? This is what Vermont ran into with their act dealing with the consolidation and restructuring.
Those are bigger, Rick, those are real issues. I think they're beyond certainly
Beyond us.
Dave's good effort to try and put something on paper, which
Yeah.
again, I thank very much him for doing. I think that's a bigger issue, Rick, that's beyond the scope, but it is an important one. So you're raising an issue that the legislature
Right.
should address.
So time check here. We've got about 15 minutes left on our schedule for this morning. Jay, you've got your hand up.
Right, thanks, David. I was noodling on the first part of this, and my suggested wording is that the opportunity for an adequate education is based on student needs and community characteristics and can be best equalized with differentiated state funding. We could use targeted state funding if you wish, but personally, I have a aversion to using the word targeting when it comes to funding or any other kind of
Agreed.
social policy. But anyway, I'd suggest that I think what we're saying in the first part could be a little bit more consistent with other discussions we've had. If it said the opportunity for an adequate education is based on student needs and community characteristics and can be best equalized with differentiated state funding.
I like that.
And can be best made more equitable, I would offer, instead of equalized.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, good.
Yep. So is that a good bullet there? If we're not going to use the word targeting, we shouldn't be using the word bullet. So for that point,
We've gone to the bad pun section of the meeting.
hey, we got 10 minutes left of this meeting. So, all right. What do we want to do with, and we're not, obviously we're not even going to get to reviewing the key features of the Mass 70 plan. I think everybody's got a copy of Dick's memo on that, but if there are going to be what was the term? Differentiated state funding. So, and if that differentiated state funding is not there to provide 100%, so there's going to have to be some local funding there. And I'm talking about local funding to raise the funds that are estimated in the model to reach whatever is decided to be an adequate outcome. So the cost of an adequate education is whatever's defined for this outcome. Does there need to be any teeth in the state funds to require the local school district to raise whatever local funds it needs to get there? Does Massachusetts have that?
Well, yes, I think so.
But they haven't had to use it, I don't think.
Well, they just started, so, you know.
No, they didn't just start, Dave. This has been going
Well,
on
it's
for
20
20 years.
years.
It's just
Yeah.
the formula's changed a little bit.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I'm talking about their current formula. Yeah.
It's basically the same structure.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
It's very similar. Yeah.
Okay.
I just don't know if New Hampshire has the income information that we need. I mean, I personally really like the idea of those minimum contributions at the municipal level, but I'm not sure how we can really fairly do it without having that income information that Massachusetts has.
Yeah, go ahead, Bill.
I think Mary's point is a good one. I think, Mary, I bet you we could, you know, over a couple of years, we could develop a database through, you know, collection of information that could support a similar decision. I think one of the things about the local mandatory minimum that is good is there are failures in local government that include some communities might have, and we all know living in New Hampshire, they've happened, where a group gets together and gets control of the local government process. They may not value public education highly, and all of a sudden they're not raising funds locally that one would think. And Mary, I'm looking at you because I would say that one of the problems that sticks in my craw is the tax cap in Manchester.
I agree.
By the way, I know you're going to shoot me for, I know, not shoot, no targeting, no bullet. But I think that, I think having some assessment of assuming that, you know, and by the way, I'm assuming I could be a single person on the commission who supports a good substantial role for the locally governed tax. You know, so I'm not asking you all to join me. You will all make your own decisions, but I know that because you're great folks. But I think for me, I see that, and I would like to, as part of my system then, have an assessment of whether the local community is meeting its commitment, its minimum commitment through its locally governed tax authority to provide, to help meet, as Jay said, the total cost that we're identifying as an opportunity goal. And so, Mary, I just wanted to raise, the reason I like mandatory minimums is not that it's gonna, you know, be at, you know, $13 a thousand or $14 a thousand. I'm thinking that some communities can't tax cap their way to into greater state aid.
I agree with everything.
Oh,
If we could figure that out, I would love it.
Yeah, the other interesting thing too about that bill, and you know, different from how AIR modeled the mandatory minimum, it's not $5 for everybody. It's
Right.
the way it's done in Massachusetts is it is based on
Right.
equalized valuation and I think average median family
Income.
income or something
Yeah.
like that.
Yeah.
And and I think it's determined that way so that the overall tax burden is relatively similar, across, throughout the districts.
Yeah, but Dave, we have to keep in mind that the Massachusetts system also has a ceiling to it, so that
Yeah.
so that wealthy towns with a lot of property tax wealth, reach that, when they reach that ceiling, their contribution ends, and in effect, they taper down to, you use the $5 rate as an
Yeah.
example, to $2 or $1. And so very substantial inequity built into, from
Oh,
a
okay.
statewide taxpayer's perspective, very substantial inequity built into that system.
So the Massachusetts style mandatory minimum may not be something that we want to look at here, but something more along the lines of that local districts may have to raise additional money to reach the estimated costs that for their public education. And I guess the question would be is if they decided not to raise the additional money. I mean, let's say town A said, hey, we're okay with this grant we got from the state. We know it's not 100% of what the estimated cost of an opportunity for an adequate education, but we're okay with that, and we're not going to raise any more money.
Well,
We
this
hire Bill Ardinger then to set them straight.
But this is where the dovetailing with other things outside the commission's role, I think, is important. This is where it dovetails with accountability measures. This is why states like Massachusetts have very annualized plans for improvement, what you're doing. If you fall into, category 4 or 5, you risk takeover. I mean, this is why they have all those other
Okay.
kinds of measures.
Very good point.
Okay, really good point, Chris. So
And Chris,
rather than
to follow up, Chris, just to follow up, Governor Lynch's proposal had those kind of Massachusetts backstops. Whether they funded the state resources sufficient to put together plans and work with local districts remains to be seen, but it was in piece of legislation.
All right, so again, keeping an eye on time, changing this sub-bullet rather than incentives or enforcement, accountability measures to assure that districts are performing up to the expected standard. Yeah.
Something like that, yeah.
Yeah. We'll come up with better language.
Dave, how are you going to deal with exceptions on this? Where, for example, I'm living in a Berlin and Brown paper company disappears all of a sudden. And yet they still have to maintain their municipal tax rate, which they have done and increased significantly. But the education component is a different animal and they've had to reduce because they can't afford any additional property taxes. There's just so much in the pot there. So, and the tax base has shrunk, certainly with the national properties all around, et cetera.
But I think that's where the differentiated state funding
That's right.
plan would factor that in, so that if like in Bow, you've got the Merrimack Station, and then it no longer becomes a contributing taxpayer, then that gets factored into the differentiated state funding.
So you're putting that, so in your definition of accountability measures, you would have some kind of an exception written in there?
Well, it wouldn't be an exception in accountability. They would be getting
condition.
increased dollars,
Right.
because their formulas would have changed, right?
Okay.
Yeah, and if their performance is, found to be because they're not contributing the local dollars necessary to get to that, expected estimated cost for an adequate education. I mean, if their performance measures are fine, then okay. But if their performance measures are not, and they're not raising and appropriating what is expected, then I think that's where accountability comes into play.
Lawrence is a good example of that. In Massachusetts, I think they're only required to put in 10% based on valuation and income, and yet they still couldn't meet the state's accountability standards, which is why they've been 5 years in a takeover. I'm not suggesting we would do takeovers, but I mean, I think that's how these things come together.
Dave, I like the idea of accountability and performance measures. Now, I don't know if everybody sees accountability as performance or.
That's what I see, yeah. But I could see why it's good to spell that out, because
I think
people
so.
might not, Rick.
Rick, what we'll do is we'll just send you up there to run the district once.
I lived in Rumford, Maine, and I know what it's like living up there in that type of the country.
All right, where are we on time? We're just after 12. Let me.
David?
Yeah.
And just, one of those accountability standards is that when there is differentiated aid, that it actually is used to address the adequacy of the education opportunity, the equitable educational opportunity. It gets applied in that manner. So I think that's I think that the accountability standard is a valuable one if we can define it in what we mean by accountability.
I think what you just raised is like the first step in accountability, that at least it's getting applied. That's what these plans you would review for. You're at least applying resources to your sources of inequity.
Yeah, and I think one of the huge strengths behind the outcome-driven approach is that you can now measure for accountability, as opposed to, well, did you spend the right amount of money on, XYZ, on the inputs.
I caution tightening that up too much, though, because, just as there's a phase in here, if you've been a low performing district because you've got really high needs kids, it takes a lot of outside intervention, which again, we haven't had, and time to get there. So that's going to be a tricky thing. And tricky with the legislature not to look for miracle cures here. In terms of outcomes.
Not going to happen overnight. So
David, one of the questions, not to throw a wrench in here, but as you look at the issue of trying to evaluate the accountability and performance measures, my presumption is that there is an assumption here that the Department of Education has the capability of being able to provide that data. And as we know from our work in our committees, that capability, I think, is highly questionable at this time, just because of their lack of their own internal resources. So I just want to kind of put that in there, that as we move forward, my presumption is that the department will play a much greater role in looking at this whole performance question.
Yeah. So Mel, that's definitely on us and in the legislature to make sure that the department is resourced properly. But something, and I forgot what document I was working on, and I left it in there. But data collection should be something that we're all
exactly
considering. In every element of this work, whether it's adequacy costing, whether it's performance, you know, measurements, stuff like that. What's the data collection look like?
Because one of the things that Mass does have is that when you have an underperforming school for a series of years, they go in and take over the school district. We don't have that capacity here. And so I'm not trying to be Mel Downer here, but I just think that's part of the reality piece here, that as we begin to look at this standard, which I agree with, that there's a concomitant factor here of being able to have the resources to be able to fulfill that.
Right, right. Well, and that's what Chris was just talking about. And that's why we're just going to send Rick back up to Rumford.
But wait a minute here, you know, it goes a lot farther than just having the resources. Statute law says in New Hampshire, you can't take over a school district.
Yeah.
And I'm not suggesting of
Local
taking
control.
over a school district. I'm just saying that
Yeah.
that as we look at if we're effective in this, it is going to change some modification of how we look at performance and how we look at meeting particular standards.
I concur, Mel.
Yeah. So,
Mhm. Yeah. And you know, I think districts want to do the right thing.
oh yeah.
And they certainly have the you know, administrators and leadership to be able to do that. You know, the question is there the capacity at the local level to raise the dollars necessary to do that? And we're clearly beyond that in many districts across the state. And the whole idea here is to rectify that problem. So,
Right.
all right, we don't have much left here, and but I think there are things that we may want to consider. And Rick, I'm going to really take into consideration whether we should schedule another work group meeting to so that we can sort of, you know, let these soak a little bit and then address the remaining ones before we take this to a commission meeting. But I need to talk with Mel and Jay and Bruce about how that affects the calendar. But things that I think we still need to talk about are and they've come up before. What if a local district raises over and above the estimated costs? Should some of what they raise go into a statewide, you know, the education trust fund? I think the example that was given by one of the commission members a while ago was if Bedford decides to spend a little more, shouldn't Franklin benefit?
Right, that was John Beardmore's point.
I
Now I
got it.
understand what you're talking about, and I certainly, as one member, I might have some wording changes, because I was thinking, wait, isn't this the state property tax? But it's not the point. It's the local property tax, governed property tax. And at some point, if you go over a certain amount, should you have to kick skin in the game to your fellow neighboring communities? And I think I would support that principle.
Right.
I wouldn't support it based on what happened in Vermont. And I would also want us to think about how the extra dollars that places like Bedford are going to have to raise play into this.
Yeah.
So if you're going to have to, because remember, we don't want regression to the mean here. We want New Hampshire to continue to be a high performing state. We don't want to force people into choices that they used to make, but now can't make because they are paying so much extra for the foundation aid, in addition to what they're trying to maintain locally. And then on top of that, this is a third cap. I think it's, you know, talk about incremental. I think you can't like sink people overnight.
That's unbelievably convincing, Chris, what you just said. And you're basically saying, like, yeah, so I could go with Chris.
I vote with Chris.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I've been thinking about that too, and maybe it's something that comes into play, you know, later on after things have settled down a bit. But I think it's something that just, you know, in there for consideration. I don't know what sort of words and you know, maybe we just want to leave it out for now. But I don't necessarily think we want to lose ideas.
Right, you know, but I do think, I mean, this is not all about money. The acrimony that exists in Vermont with that has split communities within community. I think we seriously need to be aware of the negative consequences that have occurred through a series of changes,
Yeah.
maybe well-meaning theoretically, but it's just killed people in these communities. And I don't want to see that happen in our state.
I
Yep.
agree, Chris. That's what happened in California when they did a kind of equal first and last dollar thing. Their commitment to public schools went just down the toilet. And I think that what that says is local government, it's an overused term and people so it so lightly, but local government actually has some pluses and not just cons. And I
So-
think in Vermont, they're tanking.
So related to that bullet could also be the, like a Prop 2.5, some sort of limit on how much local property taxes can go up. Is that something that,
No, that's
No,
very bad. in my
no,
Very bad.
that's awful.
okay, no, I'm just putting it out there. Yep. Yeah, and actually John Beardmore had sent over, and I'm not sure I sent it out to the group, a couple of policy papers, one pro and one opposed to those sorts of limits. So stuff to consider there. But
Can you send us those papers?
Yeah.
Dave?
Yep.
Yeah, I'd love to see it.
I'm just making a note. Phase in, we haven't really discussed any phase in stuff, but let me, I think we're sort of beyond the timeline for today because we've got meetings all afternoon and I know people need to take a break. But I'm hoping we'll be able to move forward with something like what Rick suggested, being able to revisit these after thinking about them after a really good work group meeting today, where we hash stuff out and finish it up, and also be able to have seen what adequacy talks about today with their principles, because there's obviously some dovetailing.
Can Jordan
here.
send this information out that's on the screen right now?
Yeah, we can do that. Jordan?
To
Yeah.
everybody.
Yeah, I'll
Yeah.
send this document out to everybody, and I'll also put the edited version up on the website.
Yeah, I mean, the edited version, like with all the change tracking and everything. Yeah, let's
Yeah.
keep all, let's not lose any of the mess. So it's supposed to be messy. Okay. All right. So we've got what, public engagement at
One.
1. I think Mel's
Adequacy at
already
3.
dropped off, and adequacy at 3. So Jay, are you excited?
That's the name of the week, right? We pumped.
Well, it's life in the Senate, isn't it?
All around.
Yeah.
Busy time.
So,
Dave
all right.
Luno, thank you for putting this on. That is a gigantic step to put it on paper. I can't thank you enough for that leadership.
Well, I think this is a team effort, and I've said it from the beginning that I want to work together as part of this team. It's really important that I think we're moving this forward with all of our inputs and ideas, and we'll it's hard to land the plane when you don't know where the airport is, and there's a little bit of that going on, but I think we get to a better place as a result of that. So anyway, we're good for now. We'll see everybody 1 o'clock and then at 3. So, all right. Thank you.